Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to cover a subject which I've been asked about several times, which is how I made the video that this is a still from. Essentially it's a photographic scene over which I placed some 3D rendered water and animated water and had an object come out of the water and affect the water and obviously the reflections of the water which are reflecting the background scene. So I'll briefly play you the video. A lot of people have asked me how this is done and then I'll go through all the different ways that this was created. It's actually relatively straightforward. So here we go. So that's the video, and obviously this is the scene, and I'll just quickly show you all there is in the scene. So there is a plane, and you can just about make out that there is some ripple effects in it, and here is a slightly distorted plane, and I'll explain later why it's distorted, which has got my photographic image on it. And then I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail how this object was created, but I'll show you the basics. Just a weird little object I created as the displacement object, and obviously the whole thing is animated. You can see that the object comes up through the plane, affects it, you can see ripples coming from it, and the ripples follow the object as if perhaps water was dripping off it or whatever, and then eventually it moves towards the camera, which is down here and out of view. So I'll create a new scene, and here we go. So to start with, let's get our background image up. That'll give us a starting point on where to go. Now I could use the images as planes add-on. Not all of you will have that loaded, so I'll just do it from scratch. So we'll add a plane. I'll look at it from the top. I'll stretch it SX on the x-axis, and we'll stretch it a little bit SY on the y-axis. We'll now rotate it on the x-axis, so it's RX, and we'll rotate it 90 degrees. So now look at it from the front. We'll go into orthographic mode, go into edit mode, press U, project from view, bound. So that's now UV unwrapped, nice and flat. We'll go into materials, we'll say new material, it'll be an emission material, which will be an image, and we'll go and open the image. I have the image in here, it's a photograph I took myself. It's actually a dystrophic lake in Poland. Dystrophic seems to mean that it's very acidic from all the pine trees around it. I'll scale it a bit more on the Z-axis, there we go, that's a bit better. And as you can see, this is the real photograph, and you can see that it's got this pool of water. Now for a while I did play around with adding this foreground in as well, but with these blades of grass that's quite complex. It would probably be easier to create a 3D rendered foreground, but in the end I just decided to go with a big pool of water here. So none of this is visible, none of the water is visible. But an important element is this edge of the water. Now if that's completely flat, it's really easy. Because it isn't, I ended up needing to distort this object slightly in order to make the 3D rendered water match up in perspective terms with the image. So we'll go into edit mode and Control R, and we'll add a few loop cuts. That should probably be enough, which will just allow me to push elements of the image forward and back to help line them up with the next plane that we create. And we'll do that now, and we'll add a mesh plane, look from the top. Doesn't really matter too much about unwrapping it, but I will anyway. So into edit mode, U, project from view, bounds. Now we'll look from the camera view. So come out of edit mode, bring up my camera, we'll move the camera around a little bit. Obviously I want to be able to see the surface of the water, so we'll move the camera forward a little bit and we'll alter the angle of the camera slightly. So now the photographic image is just about filling the scene. We'll go in slightly more, but obviously we need to move it around a little bit. Now you can see I can get, say, this edge to align with the plane, but I've still got a little gap of water here. So let's scale my plane up a little bit. And in fact I want it to come all the way forward, so G, Y, and let's move it forward. So now it's off the bottom of the camera, and we'll drag it that way a little bit. But I need this area to be filled up. Now if I was to distort this plane, it would no longer be flat, the reflections wouldn't work properly for what we want to do. So what I need to do is to distort this plane. The easiest thing to do is just set this so that we've got a little bit of bank there, but the rest is as it is. We can move it around a little bit in order to give it a slightly more of a 3D effect. Rotate Z, and obviously we can even move things up and down like this. So roughly speaking, we've got our bank just showing above our flat plane here. So we'll save that, and we're ready now to create some water. So we'll select that. Now typically people usually use glass for water, and if you need to see through it, you will need to do that. But for applications like this, where we're really just focusing on the reflections on the water, you don't need to use glass, and I recommend against using glass unless you have to. Very often, even if you need to see through it, you can use a combination of glossy and transparent to get what you need. It's only really if you want the refractive or magnifying effects of water when it's distorted that you will need to use a glass shader. And the problem with the glass shader is it does cause an awful lot of noise, which ends up showing as fireflies or little bright specks. So avoid the glass shader unless you need to use it. So here we go, and I'm going to add a new material, and it's going to be a glossy. I don't need to see through this water. You really, unless you've got polarized glasses on, you can't see through water at this angle anyway. And we'll just leave the defaults as they are for a moment, and we'll come over here. I'll set my sample render to 10 and my full render to 25. And I'll put border on, which means it doesn't try to render what's out here. So let's give that a render and see what it looks like. And as you see, it's not perfect. It obviously needs a little bit of tweaking, but essentially that's it. There's the bank. We can see everything 100% reflected in the water. Now obviously this water is literally mirror flat, so that isn't quite what we're looking for. So there's a number of things we need to do, especially given we want to make this an animated scene. So the next thing that we're going to do to the water is we're going to open the node editor. Don't be afraid of the node editor. It's a lot of things you can do with it, and once you get the basic concept, it's pretty straightforward. So we need to add a displacement to this surface, which will begin to make it look more like water. So I'm going to add a texture, which is going to be a noise texture. And if we just plug that straight in and have a look, you can see we're already getting sort of, well, ripples really. It already begins to look like water, but it's not quite what we want. It's certainly too low a frequency at the moment, so let's put that up to 25. Very choppy water now, but certainly still looking much more like water than it was. And we'll now add a math node set to multiply, which allows us to multiply by a number less than 1, which will obviously reduce the height of those ripples. And already I think that's beginning to look more like real water. Let's put it up to 50. Obviously the scale you select here will depend on the scale of the scene. So here we're a relatively long distance from the surface of the water, so the ripples, the smallest ripples anyway, should be quite small. If this is a close-up scene and there's perhaps grass blades in it, that sort of scale, then you might want to go for a much smaller scale, smaller in number, which means that the ripples are larger. And I'm going to go for even bigger than that. And then we just play with this. That's 0, so perhaps 0.05, and that just gives us a little bit of distortion. You can put a tiny bit of roughness on, 0.001 maybe, if you want to add just, it sort of simulates even finer ripples. But bear in mind, at the moment, these ripples are not animated. Doesn't matter where we go in the timeline, the ripples don't change. So let's do something about that. So we'll add a texture coordinate. Remember, we've UV unwrapped this, so we're going to use the UV coordinates. And now we'll add a mapping node, and we'll put that there. We'll put the UV coordinates into the mapping node, and then the output of the mapping node into the vector input of our noise. So far nothing changed, and that's because nothing's changed on here. If we look at location and I set X to 1, you may have been able to notice that everything moved on there slightly, and if I change Y to say 2, everything moved. And if I change anything on here, as I change it, the ripples move. So that immediately gives us a way to put moving ripples on our water surface. So with the timeline set to 0, my full timeline is 250 frames, but obviously that's up to you. With the timeline set to 0, hover the mouse over location and press I, and you see they turn yellow. And now we'll go to the end of the timeline, so we're at 250 now, and let's change these numbers. Let's just put each of them to 1 and press I again. Now without rendering, it's hard to see in Cycles exactly how effective you've been with that, and what you can typically do is do a very low resolution render that just gives you a general idea of whether the speed of the ripples is right. The main point is not to go to too big a number because it'll just be rippling way too fast. So we can sort of see, it's difficult to see, but we can sort of see that things are going on there. They may be too fast, and you'll just have to play really with the numbers that you want. You can see, for example, if you look at some of these highlights down here, you'll see them moving as we go through frames, and that gives you an idea as to how fast. And then they're moving quite quickly actually. In all probability I might set that to less than it is, so 0.5 for each of them. And you can obviously make them negative or positive. You can make them change in different ways over time. But this is really just the little tiny ripples on the water. This isn't the big ripples that we're going to have with the object. And what we might also do, I've just selected the plane in the background, G, Z, and I'm now going to just lower it a little bit, go into edit mode and select those two, and perhaps just lower those two a little bit, back into rendered mode. And that's beginning to look much more realistic now. I think you'll agree with me in terms of simulating a surface of water with a sunny tree filled background. That comes pretty close. So we've got our scene created. Now what we need to do is add our object. So I could create it in fact I will, I'll create it in another layer and move it over there in a moment. So I'll just add a mesh, which is going to be an icosphere. Go into edit mode, press X for delete, and I'm going to say only faces. And you'll see that leaves us a sort of skeleton. And once you've got that, what you can do is go to object, convert to curve from mesh. Now you won't see any difference here, but if you look over here, you've now got a curve properties, and that allows us to do some things with these little lines, as it were. At the moment they're invisible, but what we can do is change the bevel depth, and you'll notice they start to thicken up. And if I increase the resolution as well, they'll start to become rounded. I'll turn it on to smooth shading, and we start to see some interesting effects. You want to Control A and apply any scale, because otherwise the thickening of these lines doesn't work quite as expected. And certainly there's some issues with the normals in here, which we'll look at in a moment. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on how I created that shape. I'm just going to make something approximating it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to convert that back into a mesh. So we go to Object, Convert, Mesh from Curve Object. That looks a lot better. Go into edit mode, select all the faces, and we'll just say remove doubles. Yep, there's some doubles in there, and we'll also recalculate the normals. And obviously I spent a little bit longer on it. You can get some interesting effects with these sorts of shapes, by the way, if you add a subdivision surface. And I'll do that for this one. See, I've got some strange little curves. You get sort of broken ends like that, but it's quite interesting. So we'll go with that shape. Sorry about the lorry outside. Somebody's having a skip taken away. So the next thing, we'll just go back into edit mode and I'll add a shape in the middle. What I'll do is Shift S and snap cursor to selected, and that means when I create a new object it will appear right in the center of this one. So I'm now going to add another icosphere, but I'll set it to only one subdivision this time, and we'll go with the default size. Come over here, we'll say new material. This will be the base material, we'll call that base for the whole object, but I've still got my central object selected, so I'll add a new material and we'll call this one glow. We'll make that one a sort of yellow emission color to start with. And I'll also put it on a pass index of 1 and set the viewport color to yellow as well. So we'll go back to my base color and we'll make this a mix shader. We'll give it a glossy. In fact, I'll put the glossy on the bottom. Doesn't really matter, but that's just my habit. And a diffuse on the top. Give it a sort of purpley color and make the reflections relatively low. And what we need to do is go to our glow color and assign that. So now you can see we've got our strange alien object. So I'll now move that to my primary layer. Doesn't necessarily need to be, but it makes things easier, but it also makes it quicker and easier when I'm setting scale and so on. So we'll have a scale somewhere around there, and at the beginning of the scene we'll have that set to just below the surface, about there. Back to my camera view, we'll go to material view so we can see what's going on. We'll save this and we'll record the location of the object. I'll just apply the scale as well. So I will then come to, bearing in mind it's 25 frames a second, so over the course of 2 seconds, so roughly there, I'm going to move the object above the water, and it'll only just above the water. Record that position. Then over the course of 4 seconds, which will take us up to about 150 roughly, I wanted to move there, and let's make it move back a little bit as well. Record that position, and then by the time we get to the end frame I want it to have moved completely off frame. Now I moved that in a very linear way, but because it's only the keyframe points that are used for the in-betweening, it will actually work out a sort of diagonal line, and I'll show you that now. So I've recorded that position, we go back to the beginning and let's see what our object does. So it comes up through the middle, It then moves across to the left. By default, this is sort of slowing up and speeding up and slowing down. So in a sort of naturalistic way. You can change that to linear if you want it to be a more mechanical look. And there we go. So that's the basis of that. And if we stop that and just have a quick look at the rendered version, obviously we need some lights in there. Now I've got some default lights set up, but those obviously wouldn't be right for this particular scene. They're just some general lights. You need to make the light match as best as you can the background, and we'll do that in a moment. But you can see that's sort of roughly approximating it, but we've got nothing that links that object to the water. Even as it comes up through the water, there's no impact of the object on the water surface. So we'll do that next. I'll have it just about there where we can just see where it is, and we'll select our water and we'll go to modifiers and we'll add a wave modifier. And the next thing we'll do is we'll select the start position as our alien. Now at the moment the wave modifier is huge. I'll go back to the solid. You can see the whole thing is rattling up and down, so that's way too big. So what we need to do now is subdivide this plane in order for the ripples to show up, because obviously there's only 4 vertices at the moment. So in edit mode, go to subdivide and turn that up, and we'll set it to 50. We'll see what that looks like. With coming out of edit mode, make sure we've got smooth shading on. Now we can see what's going on, so we can play with the depth of that. It's going to need some more work, and I'll show you what to do for that in a moment. So you just adjust these settings. There you go. You see the speed will set how many ripples you get, so generally you're going to want quite a few. And what I'm also going to do is add another modifier, which is a subdivision surface, and I'm going to put that smooths it, but I want to actually give it more vertices as well for the wave modifier. So I'm going to push that above, and you see how much more defined they become. So let's have a look at what the rendered viewport looks like. So it's still rather large, but at least it's there now, so we're actually getting ripples that flow out. So what we can do now is smooth them out a little bit, or reduce the height. The narrowness is sort of how sharp those ripples are. The height is literally the height, whether it's a negative or positive number. So we want them actually fairly low, because this is supposed to be a largish scale. And then the width, obviously, again, how wide each individual ripple is. So let's try something like that, and let's let it run a little bit. So by the time the object is there, you can see we're getting ripples running across the entire pool. And what you may not want is, in fact, those ripples going all the way across, because this is meters or would be in the real world. So what you might want to do is use the fall off. So we start to turn that up, and we'll just come out of this view, go back to 0 for a moment, and let's just turn that. Now you can see we've got some ripples here, but nothing out here. Let's look at the rendered version of that. They're a little bit subtle at the moment, so let's increase the height of those ripples a little bit. So as you can see, it's a matter of playing with the settings to match with the scale and so on of the scene that you're creating. And let's let it run round a little bit, and perhaps fall off of 1 is a bit too high. The fall off is the period over which the waves reduce in height, over which they disappear. So if you have 0, then it's obviously no fall off. If you have a number, then that is the number of Blender units that the waves will disappear. So the fall off will be more rapid, they will disappear more quickly until you get to 0, when all of a sudden they'll fill the pool. Just one of those funnies of Blender. So I think perhaps let's try 1.5. So that's about similar to probably what I had on the other one. You might want it a bit bigger, perhaps, just to simulate the ripples running away into the distance. And essentially that is it, because you can already see, because we've set the start position for the ripples as the alien, this alien shape that I made, and the alien shape is already animated, you will see as it moves across that the ripples will follow it. And if I let it get to about there and then let it render, you can see there they are. So if we now, so there's only really one little element left, but we'll just give that a render because we're going to need the render in a moment anyway. So that's just going to render a 25 passes render. And because we're not using water or glass shaders, we're only using glossy shaders, we're not getting too much in the way of noise in the scene. It's pretty good, given this is only up to about 15 passes at the moment. So just let that finish, and then we'll go into the node editor for the final compositing of the glow on this element, and then I'll set some lights and do a final render. So okay, so that's our initial render pass. So we'll drag that down and we'll go to the node editor and we'll say use nodes. So right now it's just taking the image straight out. In fact, we need to do another render pass because I forgot to turn on, under passes, material index. We need to be able to separate out this material in here in order to do something to it. So F12 to render and wait for that. Okay, so we've now got an index MA output, and if you recall, under the materials for this object, the glow material I set to index pass of 1. So if we now go back to our node editor and we use the converter, which is the ID mask, put that in there, drop that into there, and we'll just take that straight to the output to start with. Now because the little polygon in the middle there is the only object with an ID mask, in fact that's the only thing not selected. So if we set this now to 1, that is now the only thing being passed through, as it were, and if we put anti-aliasing on, it just smooths the edges a little bit. So we now know we can use this as a mask to select only that object. So I'll now add a mix node, color mix node, and I will put the output of that mask into the color mix node, and we'll put black on the bottom and white on the top, and take that to the output. And again we can see that the mask is making black selected and white otherwise. So in actual fact I'm going to go the other way around. I'm going to put black on the top, white on the bottom, there we go, and now I'm going to put my original image into the bottom. So now it's showing what was really there. So if that had some sort of advanced texture or image on it, that would show through. Strictly speaking, not necessary for the sort of scene I'm doing, but it shows you the theory of how to use an ID mask. So there's my object. Now I want to apply an effect to it, so I'm going to add a filter which will be we'll go with a glare filter for now, and we'll fit that into there, and we'll say fog glow, and we'll turn the threshold right down, and immediately you can see we've got a glow around it. Play with the size a little bit and say high quality. So now what we want to do, we've got a sort of glow effect around it, we want to mix that back in with the original scene. So Shift D to create a duplicate of that mix node, color mix node. This time change it to add, because this is a glowing object, so the light it emits should add to the original scene. We'll add that into here, we'll actually put it on the bottom one. This is the mix node, and on the top we will put the original scene. And it'll take a second, composite it as you can see, and there it is. That's not really showing enough for my taste. I think I'd like a little bit more. We could go for mix, but the problem with mix node is it will darken the whole scene, or we could go with lighten. So that will only lighten what is already there rather than anything else. So you can see there is a little bit of glow around it, but in fact I think what I originally used, something a bit more controllable, so I've removed the glare node and I'm going to add a blur node. Put that there, connect that in. We'll say relative, we'll say fast Gaussian, and we'll say relative, and that means that if we change the scale of the image, the scale of this blur will be changed with it. And now if I set this to say 2.5, that's setting how much it blurs it, and you can see that's a much stronger effect. We'll go back to add on here, and it's actually slightly better. I think that's a better effect for these purposes, and obviously you can back it off slightly if you want to here, and that just biases it towards the original image, and you just find about the right place. So that basically is the effects on how you create the glow, and the final element will be just to put a lamp in the scene that somewhat replicates where the sun is. So if we go to material, we can really see there's shadows on this grass down here, so the sun is up and to the left slightly, perhaps behind the camera. So I'll add plane, we'll lift that up, we'll rotate it a little bit, rotate on the Z, bring it over here somewhat, rotate again. Strictly speaking, you should probably use spheres, but generally it doesn't matter too much unless you've got really sharp reflections. We then put a material on that which is an emission, give it a yellow color because it is supposed to be a sun, and then we'll go to the camera and rendered mode with the lamp still selected. So you can see there's a bit of light shining on the inside of this thing from the object in the middle, but really we're not getting a lot from the sun that we've got. So we'll now put this up to 25 and we start to get it. And if you want to change the way the shadows work, you change the scale of the object, but bear in mind you'll have to change the strength as well. A larger light source will give you softer shadows, more blurred shadows. A small one will give you very sharp shadows. Now the sun gives fairly sharp shadows, especially when it's bright like this, but in this scene they're not that sharp. So what I'm going to do is come over to scale, and I'm going to say 3 for for the scale. Now that's also made it a lot brighter. That's just the way that Cycles works with emission shaders. So we'll set this down to 10, perhaps even lower than that, 5. So now you can see that they're much softer shadows, and you just have to play with this. I'm changing it down a little bit further, maybe 4, to get something which you think is a reasonably convincing level of light, and obviously play around with the position of it. So essentially that's all there is to this scene. I hope you found it useful. If you did, let me know. If you've got any suggestions or requests for future tutorials, just say so in the comments below. I read them all and try to respond to most of them. Thank you for watching the tutorial, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.